Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
It's great to be here.
So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are like an absolute monarch.
Okay, I'm following.
Right, so you control the army, you've got the treasury, the courts, all the land. And a philosopher just walks right into your throne room, looks you dead in the eye, and tells you that if you use your power to collect unfair taxes, you are literally no better than a mugger holding a knife to your citizens' throats in a dark alley.
Wow. I mean, that is bold.
Right. It sounds like a fiery tweet from a modern political dissident, but it's not. That is actually a 2,000-year-old piece of advice written directly to kings.
Which is just, it completely shatters the illusion we tend to hold about ancient wisdom, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely.
We usually approach these old texts expecting a guide on how to, escape reality. We expect asceticism.
Fasting, sitting in a cave, that whole thing.
That's exactly. Severe self-discipline, avoiding all physical indulgences just to achieve this spiritual purity. We just assume ancient sages want us to transcend the dirt of human existence.
And then you open part 2 of the ancient Tamil classic, the Tirukkural, specifically the book known as Poral, which translates roughly to wealth or polity.
Yeah.
And you look for that mountaintop, and it is just nowhere to be found. Instead, you are waist deep in the mud of the real world. It's this fiercely observant, almost, ruthlessly pragmatic manual for survival.
Because the author of Thiruvalluvar, he wasn't writing for hermits. He was writing for people who were deeply entrenched in the social fabric.
Right. He wrote this for sovereigns, generals, financial ministers.
Yeah, and everyday citizens who had to wake up every single morning and navigate the brutal realities of power dynamics, money, volatile relationships, and, just physical survival.
So our mission for this deep dive is to extract the machinery of that text. We're going to take these verses and see how they map onto the 21st century landscape.
Because honestly, the mechanics of human ambition and fear, they haven't actually changed.
Not at all. So let's start at the absolute top of the social hierarchy, which the text views as the institution of the sovereign. We talk a lot today about how culture flows from the top down, right?
Oh, constantly.
Well, the Tirukkural treats the leader as the foundational load-bearing pillar of reality.
And the demands placed on that pillar are just immense. I mean, we're looking at a really intensely paradoxical profile of true leadership here.
How so?
Well, it requires this relentless, almost aggressive forward momentum, but combined with an absolute, unyielding submission to ethical constraints, and surprisingly, an openness to harsh criticism.
Okay, let's break down the anatomy of this leader then, because the text doesn't just vaguely say, be a good king. It outlines 6 specific pillars.
Yes, the 6 pillars of a leader's resources.
Right. Verse 381 says that anyone who possesses these 6 things, an army, a people, wealth, ministers, friends, and a fortress, is a lion among kings.
It's such a comprehensive list. And if we translate that out of the ancient agrarian context and put it into modern organizational leadership.
Right, into a corporate setting or something.
Yeah. The army might be your workforce or even your legal defense. The people are your customer base or your shareholders.
And wealth is obviously your capital, your cash flow.
Exactly. Ministers are your C-suite, your trusted advisors. Friends are your strategic alliances and your network.
And the fortress.
That is your intellectual property. It's your market moat, your defensible position.
A lion among kings needs all 6. I mean, you can't just have capital and no fortress or an army with no trusted ministers.
No, the whole thing collapses.
But what's fascinating is the text doesn't stop at resource management. It pivots aggressively to the moral weight of holding those resources.
Right. It introduces the concept of the right scepter.
Yes. The right scepter representing justice, opposed to the cruel scepter representing tyranny. And this is where we get back to that mugger analogy from the beginning.
The causality the author draws here between a leader's ethics and the survival of the state is just fascinating. The text actually says that an unjust king is, quote, more cruel than the man who leads the life of a murderer.
Which sounds extreme at first.
It does, but we have to understand why he makes that specific mathematical calculation. I mean, a murderer takes individual lives, which is a tragedy, but a tyrant wielding the cruel scepter, they corrupt the very mechanism of safety.
Right. When the law itself becomes the predator, the entire social contract just dissolves.
Exactly. The text forces the leader to look in the mirror.
It really does. Verse 552 compares a king demanding unfair taxes to a highway robber standing with a lifted lance shouting, "Give!"
Think about the psychology of that. When a mugger robs you, it's this overt act of violence, right?
Yeah, there's no pretense.
But when a state or a corporate monopoly or even a corrupt manager extracts resources unfairly using the cover of policy or taxes, they're trying to legitimize the robbery.
And the text just strips away that legitimacy completely. It's basically saying, no, you are just a thug with better branding.
A thug with better branding, exactly. And that branding is exactly what the right scepter refuses to rely on.
Yeah.
Ethical governance is framed not as some moral luxury, but as the literal source of life.
Yeah. Verse 542 says, all subjects look to king that ruleth all, just as the earth looks up to heaven for rain. Without that ethical oversight, the whole ecosystem dries up and dies.
But, I struggle with how isolating that must be.
Oh, sure.
Because we have this really pervasive cultural image today of the strong, stoic leader who answers to no one, the visionary who just, ignores the haters.
Right, the lone genius myth. But the Tirukkural demands intense vulnerability from its leaders. Verse 389 requires a king of worth to endure words bitter to his ear.
And verse 386 says, the world praises the king who is easy of access and who is free from harsh language.
Which is, there's a deep neurological truth there, actually. When a person gains immense power, their brain physically changes. Studies show power can diminish the neural processes associated with empathy.
Mirror neurons, right?
Exactly. A leader naturally becomes insulated. And if you only surround yourself with sycophants, people whose own survival depends on keeping you happy, you are flying completely blind.
So enduring bitter words is literally the only way to pierce that cognitive bubble.
Yeah, we call that 360-degree feedback today. It's the whole concept of a junior analyst feeling safe enough to walk into the CEO's office and say, hey, your new strategy is going to bankrupt us.
But that requires the leader to completely swallow their ego.
It does. But we have to make sure we don't mistake that openness for passivity.
Oh, definitely not.
Because the requirement to listen doesn't negate the requirement to act. In fact, the text addresses the boundaries of tolerance head on, and it uses some incredibly stark imagery to do it.
Let's push into that imagery because honestly, this is where the text gave me absolute whiplash.
Right.
We just established that a leader needs to be approachable and endure bitter criticism. But then, under the very same section on the right scepter, we hit verse 550.
Oh, yeah.
It says, by punishment of death, the cruel to restrain is as when farmer frees from weeds the tender grain. We go from listen to your critics to execute the cruel in a heartbeat.
It feels like a massive contradiction to our modern sensibilities.
It really does.
Yeah.
But we have to firmly ground this in the historical reality of the ancient world. They didn't have human resources departments. They didn't have rehabilitation programs.
No performance improvement plans back then.
Right. Lethal justice was the primary tool for state survival against genuine existential threats. So obviously, we're not suggesting modern managers adopt capital punishment for poor performance.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that executing someone for replying all to a company-wide email is a slight overreaction.
Indeed. But look at the underlying mechanism of the metaphor. The tender grain or the green corn represents the virtuous, productive members of the organization or society.
And the weeds are the toxic, cruel, actively harmful actors.
Exactly. The paradox of tolerance states that if a society is tolerant without limit, its ability to be tolerant is eventually seized or destroyed by the intolerant.
The farmer can't sit down and reason with the weed.
No. The weed's biological imperative is to choke out the corn. If a leader lacks the backbone to decisively root out the weeds because they want to appear universally benevolent or because they're just afraid of conflict,
the tender grain is destroyed, the good employees leave, the culture rots.
Exactly. So the right scepter requires this dual nature. You need the humility to be corrected by the wise, but the absolute steel to protect the vulnerable from the cruel.
That completely reframes the concept of management. You aren't just the boss, you are the cultivator of the environment.
Right.
If you tolerate a brilliant but abusive executive just because they bring in revenue, you are actively letting the weeds strangle your crop.
So consider the implications of this in your own life. Who is empowered to speak those bitter words to you?
Yeah, if you look around your organization or your friend group or your family and realize no one is allowed to tell you when you're wrong, your kingdom is standing on rotten pillars.
A structure without truth tellers is already collapsing. And that brings us to the mechanics of how a leader actually gathers those truth tellers.
Because you can't just walk into a public square and ask, hey, who wants to be honest with me today?
Right. You have to actively build that environment. And the text spends a significant amount of time exploring the art of counsel, the role of ministers, and the dynamics of the council chamber.
The vetting process the author lays out is terrifying in its pragmatism. Because giving someone access to the levers of power is basically the most dangerous thing a leader can do.
It's a huge risk.
Verse 501 offers this fourfold test to choose a minister. It states that you must test a candidate on their virtue, their love of money, their love of pleasure, and their fear of losing their life.
Think about the psychological stress test that represents. The author possesses zero illusions about human corruptibility.
None at all.
Before you trust someone, you literally must identify their exact breaking point. The test of virtue examines their baseline ethics. The test of money determines if they can be bought by a rival.
And the test of pleasure looks at whether they can be distracted or, blackmailed through their appetites.
Right, and the fear of losing their life. That's the ultimate one. In the ancient world, being a minister meant you might be poisoned or executed if a rival kingdom invaded.
But today, the fear of life could be translated to career survival.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, will this executive throw me under the bus to save their own reputation when the board gets angry? Will they risk their own job to tell me the truth? Or are they motivated entirely by self-preservation?
If they fail any of those four tests, their counsel is compromised.
Yeah.
But once you have vetted the right people, the focus shifts to how those people actually communicate.
The text places immense weight on the power of the spoken word. There's this brilliant metaphor in verse 401 about speaking out of turn.
Oh, yes. The text says, the desire of the unlearned to speak in an assembly is like playing a chess on a board without squares.
It's such a good image. It perfectly captures the chaos of arrogance.
It really does, because the squares on a chessboard represent the rules, the context, the boundaries of reality. If you remove the squares, the pieces have no relationship to one another.
There's no strategy.
Exactly. When a person speaks without understanding the historical context of the problem, or the nuances of the data, or even just the dynamics of the room, they aren't just contributing poorly, they're disrupting the very fabric of the game.
And that plays directly into the concept of knowing the council chamber, which honestly contains one of the most countercultural pieces of advice I have ever read.
It's very controversial today.
Yeah. Verse 714 says, "Before the bright ones shine as doth the light. Before the dull ones be as pure as stucco white."
Meaning, assume the pure whiteness of mortar.
Appear totally plain or even ignorant when you're standing in front of dullards.
You become the wall. You just blend in.
I have to push back on this a little, or at least play devil's advocate here, because the entire modern self-help and corporate leadership industry screams the exact opposite message.
True.
We are told relentlessly to bring our authentic selves to every single room. We're told to never dim our light to make others comfortable. If you're brilliant, be brilliant. So why is this ancient sage commanding us to play dumb?
Well, we need to separate the modern marketing of authenticity from the ancient strategy of energy conservation.
Energy conservation.
Yeah. The text isn't advocating for the destruction of your identity. It's teaching you to protect your most valuable resources.
Yeah.
There's a profound danger in wasting brilliance on the unreceptive.
Okay, that makes sense.
Verse 720 illustrates this beautifully. It says, "Ambrosia in the sewer spilt is word spoken in presence of the alien herd."
Wasting the nectar of the gods in a sewer. That's a sickening image.
It's supposed to be. Ambrosia represents your deepest insight, your most innovative strategy, your vulnerability. If you bring that into a boardroom filled with toxic, defensive, ego-driven individuals, the metaphorical sewer, they literally lack the capacity to appreciate it.
And worse, they'll mock it or sabotage it or steal it.
Exactly. The author is demanding discernment.
So it's a defensive mechanism. If I walk into a meeting and the executives are clearly entrenched in their old ways and terrified of change, dropping a massive disruptive idea on the table isn't shining my light.
No.
It's just painting a target on my back.
You would be playing chess without squares because
Yeah.
you fail to read the board. Sometimes strategic silence is the most powerful move you can make.
You act as the whiteness of mortar.
Yes. You observe.
Yeah.
You gather data. You wait until you are in the presence of the bright ones.
Yeah.
People who actually possess the security and intellect to engage with your ideas before you illuminate the room.
There is an immense freedom in realizing you do not owe your absolute best self to people who lack the capacity to process it.
It's very liberating.
And the practical application here is immediate. The next time you're trapped in a meeting with energy vampires or people who argue just to hear their own voices, practice the stucco white mortar.
Just watch them.
Conserve your ambrosia. You don't have to win every argument, especially when the other side isn't actually listening.
That calculated restraint is a perfect segue into the mechanics of action, because having a vetted counsel and knowing when to speak is entirely theoretical until you actually execute.
Right, you have to do something mutually.
And the text moves from the philosophical to the deeply practical in its discussion of timing, energy, and the true nature of wealth.
The text formulates success as this very specific equation. Unyielding mental energy combined with an acute awareness of your own capacity multiplied by perfect timing.
And the animal analogies the author uses here to explain timing and terrain are phenomenal.
Oh, they're so good. Like verse 481 observes, a crow will conquer owl in broad daylight.
Consider the biological reality of those two creatures. The owl is a vastly superior predator. It has lethal talons and silent flight.
And the crow is basically just a scavenger.
But the owl is blinded by the sun. The text is pointing out that inherent superiority means absolutely nothing if you engage the enemy when environmental conditions favor them.
Time of day alone dictates the victor.
Exactly. And terrain dictates the outcome just as ruthlessly. Verse 495 says, the crocodile prevails in its own flow of water wide. If this it leaves, 'tis slain by anything beside.
An apex predator in the river becomes a slow, vulnerable lizard on the riverbank.
The translation to human endeavor is so direct here. You might be the most brilliant engineer in your company, but if you are forced to fight a political battle in the marketing department's territory, you are the crocodile on land.
You will be destroyed by people with half your intellect because they control the terrain.
You must drag the conflict into the water.
And once you're in the water, you have to master the art of the strike. Verse 490 tells us to stand like a heron with folded wing, and then to snap our prey when fortune smiles.
Have you ever watched a heron hunt?
I grew up near a marsh, actually, so yeah, it is mesmerizing. It doesn't splash around chasing fish. It stands so incredibly still that it looks like a statue.
It looks completely passive, even lazy.
But its eyes are tracking every ripple, and its neck is coiled like a spring. When the moment comes, the strike is so fast you can barely see it.
That stillness is the absolute opposite of sluggishness. The heron represents concentrated potential energy.
Because the text reserves its harshest condemnations for actual sloth, sluggishness isn't portrayed as just a mere character flaw, it's an active destroyer of worlds.
Verse 605 states, delay, oblivion, sloth, and sleep. These four are pleasure boat to bear the doom to ruin's shore.
A pleasure boat to ruin's shore, it just captures the insidious nature of procrastination so perfectly.
It really does.
Because it feels incredibly good in the moment to hit the snooze button, to avoid the difficult email, to let oblivion wash over you. You think you are resting, but you're actively sailing toward your own destruction.
The current is pulling you while you sleep.
Exactly. And the author insists that this forward momentum, this energy of soul, is the only metric of true wealth that actually matters.
There's a fascinating subordination of material wealth throughout this entire section.
Verse 592 argues, the wealth of mind man owns a real worth imparts. Material wealth man owns endures not, utterly departs.
Which leads directly to the text's utter contempt for hoarding money.
Oh, the section titled Wealth Without Benefaction is brutal. It compares a miser's hoarded wealth in verse 1008 to a poisonous tree in the middle of a town.
Let's push that analogy further. Why a poisonous tree?
Well, because it takes up prime real estate. It drinks the water from the soil, it casts a shadow, it extracts resources from the community, but offers absolutely nothing in return. No fruit, no shade you can safely rest in.
Its very existence is a blight. The sociological critique here is profound. Wealth, in the eyes of this text, possesses zero intrinsic value. It is merely potential energy.
Verse 1007 uses another striking image, comparing wealth given to no one to a woman fair in lonelyhood who aged grows.
It's a lament for wasted potential. The beauty, or the capital in this case, was meant to interact with the world, to generate life, but it was locked away until it decayed.
Hoarding wealth without using it for human benefit is like, it's like spending $10 million to collect the rarest vintage cars in the world and then sealing them inside an underground concrete bunker.
Right.
No one can see them. The engines never turn over. They never touch the asphalt. What is the actual utility of that collection? You don't own cars. You just own a very expensive secret.
There's a deeper mechanism at play here that aligns really well with the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome.
Like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius.
Exactly. The Stoics categorize material wealth as a preferred indifferent.
Meaning it's preferable to have money rather than be destitute, obviously.
Right. But money itself contains no moral weight. It can't make you a good person, and it can't give your life meaning. Its only value is derived entirely from how it is deployed in the service of virtue.
If you don't deploy it, it's dead weight. It sounds identical to the modern critiques of billionaire wealth hoarding. The text is basically arguing that if you are sitting on billions of dollars while the society around you fractures from poverty, you aren't a lion among kings. You are a poisonous tree.
You are failing the most basic test of participation in the human project. Action and benefaction are the engines that give wealth its meaning.
So, if we look at our own lives, we must audit our terrain and our energy. Are you currently fighting a battle on the wrong terrain?
Are you trying to win a nuanced, highly emotional debate in the comment section of a social media platform?
Oh, that's a perfect example. That is an algorithm designed to reward outrage, not nuance. If you fight there, you are the crocodile out of water.
You'll be torn apart. Find your water. Wait like the heron.
And finding your water often means recognizing who is in the river with you, because we don't execute these strategies in a vacuum. We operate within a minefield of human connections, which brings us to the text's exploration of friendship versus enmity.
And I have to admit, the author's view of human relationships is staggeringly pragmatic. It's unsentimental and occasionally quite dark.
It really is a survivalist's view of human connection. The text divides relationships into active protective forces and hidden lethal threats. True friendship is defined solely by its reflexivity.
Verse 788 provides one of the most beautiful physical metaphors in the entire book for this.
Yeah, it says, true friendship acts as fast to save you as hand of him whose vesture slips away.
Analyze the neurobiology of that reflex for a second. If you're standing in a crowded public square and the belt holding your garment snaps, your conscious brain does not have time to process the event.
You don't form a mental committee to weigh the pros and cons of catching your clothes.
No. Before you even register the panic, your hand has moved instantaneously to cover yourself and prevent public shame.
So the author is stating that a true friend has internalized your well-being so deeply that they react to your impending ruin as if it were their own physical body being exposed.
It is instinctual protection. They step in before you even have to articulate that you are drowning.
But the relief of that image is immediately countered by the terror of unreal friendship.
Yes.
The author introduces the concept of the anvil in verse 821. Anvil where thou shalt smitten be, when men occasion find, is friendship's form without consenting mind.
The anvil is a chilling metaphor because an anvil does not actively attack you.
Right, it just sits quietly. It provides a hard, unyielding surface.
A false friend, the anvil smiles at you.
Sure.
They offer a surface of support. But they are merely holding you in place, waiting for the precise moment when the hammer of circumstance falls, ensuring that you are crushed between the two.
Their danger lies in their passive proximity.
And that proximity becomes literally venomous when the text discusses enmity within.
Verse 890 warns that dwelling with those who secretly hate you is like dwelling in a shed with a snake for company. You are locked in a confined space with a lethal, unpredictable threat.
The psychological toll of that scenario is catastrophic.
Yeah.
Think of the cortisol levels, the chronic stress.
Yeah.
If the people inside your walls, whether that's your literal household, your marriage, or your core corporate team, are secretly hostile, you can never enter the restorative phase of sleep.
You're always waiting for the strike.
Yeah.
You cannot build a fortress if the enemy is already sleeping in the barracks.
Now, I need to stop us here for a second, because as we delve into the text's warnings about the people who can destroy us, we hit a massive obstacle to modern reading.
Yes, we do.
We have to address the culturally bound elements of this ancient text with clear discernment.
Because there are entire sections of Pearl titled Being Led by Women and Wanton Women.
Right.
The verses make explicit claims that listening to your wife destroys your public manliness, that men who submit to women cannot perform virtuous deeds, and that sex workers are a hell where sink degraded souls.
Yes. We cannot simply gloss over this. It demands rigorous critical thinking. We must state unequivocally that the text's ancient patriarchal framework, the assumption that women inherently represent a corrupting, distracting influence on male civic duty, is entirely a product of the author's historical and political epoch.
It reflects the deeply flawed social hierarchy of the ancient world.
Exactly. We do not endorse or translate that literal misogyny into the present.
So the question is, if we strip away the patriarchal wrapper, is the entire section compromised? Or is there an enduring psychological warning buried underneath the historical bias?
There is a vital warning, provided we extract the mechanism rather than the target. Beneath the gendered language, the author is diagnosing a universal human vulnerability, the loss of personal agency and moral integrity to overwhelming infatuation.
The text is terrified of a leader or a citizen who allows lust or obsessive attachment or a desperate need for validation to completely override their duty to their society, their friends, and their own ethical core.
It's the danger of letting lower impulses hijack your higher purpose.
Precisely. The author used the culturally available tropes of his era to illustrate this loss of control. But the mechanism of ruin remains identical today, regardless of gender or the object of obsession.
When any person allows a toxic infatuation, whether that's a romantic partner who demands you isolate yourself from your friends, or an addiction, or even a cult of personality around a charismatic leader to dictate their actions, they forfeit their sovereignty.
They become an instrument of their own destruction.
That reframes it perfectly. It is about auditing where your agency actually resides. And that audit is the practical application for this entire section on human connection.
The text says in verse 796, ruin itself one blessing lends, 'tis staff that measures out one's friends. Ruin is a measuring stick.
It is the ultimate diagnostic tool. When you are thriving, the anvil and the true friend look identical. Only the pressure of ruin forces them to reveal their nature.
Imagine you lost everything tomorrow. Your reputation, your capital, your status. Who in your life would reflexively grab you like a hand catching a slipping garment?
And conversely, who is sitting quietly in your life right now, smiling, offering friendship's form without consenting mind, just waiting to serve as the anvil when you fall.
If you cannot confidently answer both questions, your social terrain is rigged with explosives.
The clarity of that measurement is bracing. And the concept of ruin, of surviving the absolute baseline of existence, transitions us into the final and arguably most profound dimension of the text.
Because after spending so much time on kings, ministers, and wealth, the author drives us down into the dirt. We must examine the dignity of labor and the agony of systemic poverty.
It is a stunning shift in perspective. The text moves from the high-stakes games of the throne room down to the foundational reality of the common person.
The core wisdom here is absolute. Honest manual labor is the only true source of human independence, and systemic poverty is an active degradation of the soul.
The author begins by exalting the farmer. Verse 1032 declares, "The plowers of the linchpin of the world, they bear them up who other works perform, too weak its toils to share."
The linchpin. It's the small, unglamorous piece of metal inserted through the end of an axle to keep the wheel from falling off.
Without the linchpin, the chariot crashes. The text is saying that the king with his right scepter, the minister with his brilliant counsel, the ascetic fasting on the mountaintop, every single one of them relies entirely on the person whose hands are in the dirt growing the food.
Verse 1033 goes so far as to say that only those who eat food earned by the plow truly live, while everyone else leads a cringing, dependent life. It elevates the worker above the sovereign.
It forces a reckoning with how a society assigns value. But the author does not romanticize the struggle of the poor. When the text turns its gaze to absolute poverty, the language becomes terrifyingly visceral.
It really does. It dissects the psychological destruction wrought by having nothing. Verse 1049 is one of the most haunting lines in ancient literature. Amid the flames, sleep may men's eyelids close. In poverty, the eye knows no repose.
Sleeping in flames versus sleeping in poverty. The physical agony of fire is finite. Your body will eventually succumb, or your pain receptors will overload, and you will lose consciousness.
But the grinding, unrelenting anxiety of poverty, the terror of not knowing how you will feed your children tomorrow, the constant calculation of survival, it hijacks the nervous system.
It destroys the ability to rest. It eats the mind from the inside out.
The text notes the collateral damage of that anxiety, too. Verse 1047 observes that absolute poverty makes even a mother look at her child as a stranger.
It dissolves the deepest biological and emotional bonds because the sheer panic of survival overrides human connection.
Poverty is framed not as a lack of coins, but as a violent assault on human dignity.
Which brings us to the ultimate degradation in the eyes of this text. Mendicancy. Begging. The author views begging with absolute revulsion.
Verse 1070 claims that when a beggar is refused, the shame of that refusal literally takes away his life. The spiritual death is instantaneous.
And this revulsion culminates in perhaps the most explosive, controversial verse in the entire Tirukkural. It is a verse that demands deep comparative insight to truly understand its radical nature.
Verse 1062, it reads, "If the creator of the world has decreed even begging as a means of livelihood, may he too go a-begging and perish."
Yeah.
I remember reading that and having to just put the book down. It sounds dangerously close to blasphemy. It is a blistering curse directed at the divine.
It is an intellectual earthquake. Think about how other major wisdom traditions approach the beggar. In many schools of Buddhism, the monk carrying an alms bowl is a figure of profound reverence. The act of begging is a spiritual exercise in ego death and interconnectedness.
And in the Christian tradition, you have the Franciscan friars who take strict vows of poverty and beg for their daily bread as an emulation of holy humility. Begging is often elevated as a pathway to the divine.
So why is Thiruvalluvar, an ancient sage himself, so furious? Why is he leveling a curse against the creator for the existence of beggars?
Because Tirukkural is not a text about spiritual renunciation. It is a text about civic flourishing and the mechanics of a just society.
The author is looking at a human being who has been stripped of their agency, forced to grovel in the dirt for a handful of rice, and he is sickened by it. This curse is not directed at the poor person. It is a radical, blistering indictment of the system that produced them.
It is profound empathy disguised as rage.
Exactly that. The author is declaring a theological ultimatum. If the divine architecture of the universe inherently requires that a human being must forfeit their dignity and beg just to sustain their biological life, then that divine architecture is corrupt.
And if the creator designed a corrupt system, then the creator deserves to suffer the exact same degradation and perish.
It is a demand for a universe, and by extension, a human society, where honest labor guarantees survival without humiliation.
The modern translation of that rage is chillingly relevant. We look at our own economic structures. We recently went through a global crisis where we designated certain people as essential workers, the delivery drivers, the grocery clerks, the agricultural workers.
The modern linchpins.
But does our society honor their labor, or do we trap them in the grinding anxiety where their eyes know no repose?
It forces us to look at systemic inequality not as an abstract macroeconomic statistic, but as a catastrophic moral failure of the societal kingdom. If the people turning the wheels cannot afford to eat the grain they harvest, the right scepter is broken.
The practice here, the takeaway for our daily lives, is an exercise in radical empathy. The next time you walk past someone forced to beg on the street, or you witness someone buckling under the weight of systemic poverty, resist the urge to look away.
Resist the urge to blame them for their ruin.
Recognize the societal failure taking place in front of you, and simultaneously recognize the profound privilege of your own independence. If you are able to earn your livelihood without surrendering your dignity, you hold the linchpin.
You possess the truest form of wealth the text recognizes.
We have journeyed from the throne room to the Burt. We've explored the isolation of kings, the strategic silence of the mortar, the predatory timing of the heron, the silent threat of the anvil, and the blistering rage against forced degradation.
And through it all, there is a singular unifying thread. The Tirukkural insists that your power, your resources, and your life are ultimately measured entirely by your grip on reality and your active commitment to the dignity of other human beings.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to carry with you. We spend our lives trying to build our modern kingdoms, our careers, our financial portfolios, the security of our households. But the text forces you to audit the foundation of that kingdom.
Ask yourself, if your success, your comfort, or your profit margins require someone else, a worker, a supplier, a rival, to lose their dignity so you can win, are you actually wealthy?
Or are you just a poisonous tree standing in the center of the town waiting for the roots to rot?
That is the ultimate challenge this ancient manual hurls across 2 millennia into our modern world.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.